Hi, I'm Marcel, founder of Orion Games. We're making this video to tell you the story of how our little indie studio was formed and how Arto came to be, how we tried, failed, and tried again over and over until we got to where it is today. So, without further ado, let's wind the clock back and start with our humble beginnings. I graduated with a bachelor's degree in physics in 2017, a requirement for any aspiring game dev. I was dispassionate about my studies and spent most of my time playing video games. I had no interest in pursuing a master's degree. I then had an entirely separate opportunity that exposed me to the world of business, and combining that with my passion for video games just made sense. I asked myself, but how does one make a video game? Well, most games have art. And the last time I drew anything was in 8th grade, and my drawing of a cow was mistaken for a frog. I learned a harsh lesson that day. I was no artist. But I also wasn't a very good programmer. All I knew was Python. So I decided to start off somewhere more familiar. Most games I enjoy have a good story, so my game needed a story. I started working on something short and finished it in a few weeks. It's published on Amazon under the name Island. It's my first attempt at writing a short story, so don't expect too much. It's a sci-fi story about a woman who wakes up on an island, ravished by fundamental forces of the universe. It's got things like anomalies, gravitational shifts, and gods. And you know what? If you want to know more, you could just give it a read. And if you're feeling extra generous, please join my grandma and my grandpa in telling me how wonderful it is. They both gave it a solid 5 out of 5. One piece of advice I constantly saw online about game dev was to start by making small games. Perhaps you've heard it too. Have a short development window and publish the project ASAP. This will help you learn quickly and allow you to iterate on past ideas. Makes sense. Really great advice. Which I totally ignored. Nah, I decided to shoot for the stars. And this is the story of that game. Okay. Let's jump to March of 2019. I had my story. What I didn't know until now was that I also must have suffered from a good amount of the Dunning-Kruger effect. With a team of 5, we began development on Project Island, working hard on a bunch of concept art. One might say way too much concept art. Seriously, where most solo devs or small studios start out working on an MVP, our main concern starting out was the ART. We literally had so much. The biggest inspirations for Project Island back then were 2 games I loved, Hyper Light Drifter and Bastion. They have a lot in common. They're both top-down action-adventure games with a heavy focus on combat, exploration, and world building. And they each include some character customization. What I enjoyed most about them was their satisfying combat and their setting. I knew then that even though I wanted to pay homage to those titans, I didn't want to rip them off. And then it hit me, the brilliant secret ingredient that would set the project apart from our inspirations. We'd set our game in a desaturated, watercolor world and let the players bleed color back into it. It would be visually striking. It would encourage exploration. Our first real eureka moment, probably. In September of 2019, I decided to fully commit myself to my vision, and so Orion Games was founded. The company name was inspired by my love for the constellation, but the name Orion was taken and registered, and so were most of the domains. So Orion Games became the name of our company, and OrionGames.net our domain. Best $10 I ever spent. With the company established, I shifted from working with other part-time students to stuffing up with full-time employees. I was able to hire a young 3D animator with a background in VFX and a handful of 2D concept artists. No one on the team had ever made a video game before. While we were on the hunt to hire a Unity developer, this team made the decision to adopt a unique aesthetic of combining 2D and 3D assets. All the characters were sprite sheets created from 3D rendered animations, and they would move in a 3D environment. It played out to our team's 2D strengths and allowed for us to create a unique watercolor effect outside of the engine. When our first programmer joined, he pointed out our novice mistake. A game can't have a million sprite sheets. We'd been rendering each character animation from 8 angles, so each sprite sheet for every animation and several characters had 15 or more animations. It was completely infeasible, and we decided to bring everything into the engine. To create our unique game-defining mechanic of coloring in the world, we started by using a system of projectors. Every so many units traveled, Liv, our protagonist, would spawn one, which would then generate an animated inkblot alpha that revealed the texture of the ground. To be able to activate a projector in a specific area, Liv had to first find the corresponding paint dispenser and charge up. We learned pretty quickly that the system wasn't gonna work. The amount of projectors made even medium-sized levels unplayable. They also just didn't look very good. They'd stack or look burnt out, and worst of all, they required our floors to be dark. But having brighter floors led to minimal contrast and didn't really color it in at all. So, lose-lose really. And on top of all that, this effect, which we dubbed internally as surface blot, wasn't even coloring in the floor reliably. So the defining mechanic of our game was broken. It was half-baked and contributed nothing to making the game fun. Okay, not to worry, because combat would be the other defining aspect of our game. All we had to do was nail that. At that stage of production, we had no controller support. Liv could only be moved around with a mouse and keyboard. The player could move with right click and attack with left click. We thought being precise was important, but the reality was they could only attack in the direction you were facing. We wasted so much time trying to reinvent the wheel, when no other game does that, and with good reason. Along with the primary attack, players could cast spells with Q, W, and E, and could also dodge with spacebar. Spells included Gravity Well or shooting lightning bolts, and you could even use one to reverse time like in Prince of Persia games. Except we never got ours to work, much like the rest of this level. You're probably thinking, sure, this scrappy team has made some mistakes, of course, totally normal. But they're going to learn from them, take a step back, and refine all of their current features. Nope. We totally doubled down, leaving a sea of unfinished features in our wake. The problem was that we jumped right into the vertical slice phase before having a functional concept on paper, or even a grey box prototype. As our team was mostly artists, our focus was on aesthetics, and unfortunately even that was suffering due to a lack of technical exploration and pipelining. If we could wind back the clock, I'd say we would have spent much more time and energy on prototyping over creating a flashy vertical slice. But there was a reason we chose to spend so much of our resources on it. Our funds were running dangerously low, and we were trying to attract the attention of publishers. We applied to over 100 publishers in November of 2019. Surely, one of them would have to see all the effort we'd put into the project and would want to help us achieve our vision. Well, only 5 responded, and to our dismay, it was a no from all of them. So, without the life raft of a publisher, in December, we ran out of money. If this were a game, I'd say our choices and their consequences put us on a path towards the worst ending. The ones we made during the early stages of production simply weren't the right ones, and the consequences, well, they very nearly cost us the entire project. Alright, so, obviously, running out of money was never part of the plan. Fundraising at this stage was near impossible. I pitched the game about 200 times to more publishers, funds, angel investors, anyone who would listen, and was always met with a rejection. At this point, I was faced with 3 options. 1. Close down shop and look for another job. 2. Leave America and go back to Poland, as I was here only on a visa. Or 3. Take a gamble that we could turn things around. I wasn't gonna declare the time of death on this thing just yet, so I chose option 3 and took out a loan against my apartment, which net us an additional 3 months of runway. Yeah, smart choice. But this was it. We just had 3 months to turn this around. It was time to make some hard choices. We dove deep and analyzed what we could do with the team we had. Until now, our biggest fault was refusing to drop failed ideas. We thought that if we'd spent so much time on them, we could continue to try to make them work and just cram them into the game, like a square block into a round hole.
We gotta find a way to make this fit into the hole for this, using nothing but that.
There was no way I can confirm this, but I'm pretty sure at this point, if anyone googled sunk cost fallacy, they'd just be directed to the OrionGames website. Taking a moment to acknowledge this mistake is what helped motivate us to cut content that just wasn't working. This purging moment would be instrumental in getting us back on track. I just wish it would have happened sooner. First, many things that were in our original design and features wishlist were immediately scrapped. There was no reality in which we could deliver on them. Things such as moral dilemmas, a fully branching story, clever ways of killing the bosses by having multiple hidden puzzles in the boss arenas all went out the window. We changed our entire philosophy to just focus on a few aspects of the game and polish them and refine them as much as we could. Second, we ditched the player characters model for a complete redesign. We'd been using the model that was originally designed to be rendered into sprite sheets. It had its rig hacked together when we transitioned to 3D, had its poly count cut down, and had gone through a few different hairstyles. What we had was a Frankenstein beast that neither animated well nor behaved well in Unity. It was just more baggage that should have been thrown out long ago. Third, we reworked the entire concept for the level. We took new approaches to quickly assembling asset libraries and let our environmental artist go crazy. The new level was a vast improvement, both in terms of visual quality as well as layout and gameplay opportunities. Finally, we iterated on the combat and made each ability, at the very least, functional. Liv was controlled with WSAD and would always face the cursor. All of our hard work on these changes paid off. In March of 2020, just before our funding was about to run out again, we attracted our very first private investor. Personally, living with that ever-present ticking clock extracted a very high price. I was burnt out. I lost 20 pounds and developed insomnia. To anyone watching this, I cannot stress enough the importance of self-care. We all crave some measure of success, but it should never come before your own mental or physical well-being. Securing funding, as well as renewed faith in our project, were obviously a great feeling for us all, but the fact that we kept hitting dead ends for the same reason felt less great. Still no interest from publishers. The idea for the game was just okay. The gameplay was subpar, and coloring in the world was underwhelming. We'd come so far, and yet no closer to measuring up to our two main inspirations. In April of 2020, we decided on a major pivot that would change the game in a big way. Despite its shortcomings, our world coloring mechanic remained interesting and unique. It still had the potential to be a defining feature. We decided to align all other aspects of the game behind this one mechanic. Now, story, gameplay, art direction, and sound and level design would all be in line with it. And that was when Arto was born. First, we had to rework the way the world was colored. It had to be both pretty to look at and satisfying from a gameplay perspective. We chose to use masks to reveal textures of UVs that are under Liv, which allowed us to fill an entire map without throttling the CPU. It was more reliable, created a smooth and consistent reveal, and didn't have blending issues. But we decided to take it a step further. Now, bringing color to the world would be an ingrained ability of Liv's that would not only have a visual ramification, but also story and gameplay ones. Coloring in the world would reveal its secrets, make grass grow and leaves grow, animals come to life and animate, sound effects spawn, and so much more. With the changes being implemented as part of this major pivot came our new primary directive: color is life. As we continued to sharpen the world coloring mechanic, we made the decision to rework the framework of the game's narrative, as the highly technical sci-fi story no longer worked. Instead of having gods of different sciencey religions, we'd now have gods of artsy religions. And to take it a step further, we chose to explore the idea of how different art styles represent a variety of mentalities that each carry different messages. Now, we have 6 unique Artos, rendered in 6 unique art styles. Redesigning Liv from the ground up allowed us to tie her in with a new story, as well as improve her visual appeal, with additions such as dynamic hair and cloth simulation. She no longer strafed and would snap to enemies that she hits. We invested a lot of time into reworking our core auto attacks, including a complicated comboing system akin to Devil May Cry's combat. But it was too much for our limited resources, and so we stuck to simple attacking and dashing. For each weapon, we prioritized solid animation blending, VFX, and pushing their unique gameplay features. We took extra effort to clearly communicate enemy tells. Everything had unique sound effects tied to them, and the core of our game was starting to finally look solid. Now, Arto was an open-world game with a clear 3-act structure that unfolded as the player explored the different biomes. We then ran into another roadblock. Arto was nestled very comfortably between an art game and a combat game. Being a jack of all trades and master of none meant for us that the game was still not very fun. If we compared it again to our inspirations, sure, we had a perspective camera, not an orthographic one like in Hyper Light Drifter, but our art style was lacking, and the combat didn't have that wow factor. So, we kept improving upon player control and injecting Arto with more depth.
And that's what gives your painting depth. That's what'll make your painting special.
For the team's sake, I want to stress that they all put a lot of sweat and tears to save this game and raise it up to its current state. In August of 2021, our 8-person team was rounded out with people from all over the world: America, Europe, Middle East, East Asia. With where the game was at the time, we reapplied to publishers, and one that we had previously applied to was willing to work with us. Despite the harsh terms they offered, the deal was fair, and they would finance the rest of the game's development. This was it. This was it. The agreement was ready to go. But then, the publisher was bought out by another company. We just couldn't catch a break. So, we went back to developing, and I went back to scrambling for money. Our initial investor had a friend who started a fund. Introductions were made, and after a grueling period of interviews, playtesting, due diligence, and more interviews, they decided to invest. We found another publisher in November of 2021, and these guys clearly had faith in us. We had a letter of intent signed before they abruptly pulled the deal at the beginning of the new year. Something to do with the company's falling stock price. We were receiving multiple publisher offers, but unfortunately they were all financially unfeasible for us. We wouldn't be able to survive the proposed revenue splits, which often left us far less than half. We also reached out to devs who worked with some publishers in the past, and some of the horror stories we heard had us running for the hills. Always, and I can't stress this enough, always do your due diligence when it comes to negotiating with publishers or anyone. The streak of bad news and bad luck on the business side had no effect on production, and improvements on the game steadily continued. It was a good thing too, because March of 22 would mark OrionGames' first ever in-person GDC. It was a happy moment, marking the first time most of us met in person. Armed with a new trailer, a new vision for Arto, and an upcoming official Steam page, we all sang Arto's praises to anyone who would listen. And surprisingly, a lot of people did. We were 2.5 years into production, and thrilled to have something that looked like a game. But there was one piece of feedback we hadn't managed to successfully address: the combat. Liv had a variety of unique weapons, each tied to a different Arto, and each with a special attack. One of them was a gun that we couldn't quite nail down. Firing wouldn't work unless the environment was flat. So we scrapped it in place of a pretty sick lightning whip. The days of the sunk cost fallacy plaguing OrionGames were far behind us. Liv also had a reworked dash that allowed her to take advantage of iframes and dodge enemy attacks. Finally, she had a paint projectile side weapon that, even though it looked pretty, wasn't exactly fun or very useful in its current state. It was almost easier to just get up close to an enemy, whack them a few times with your weapon, rather than shoot the paint arrow from a distance. Even the melee weapons weren't perfect. The sword's 3D trail, for example, looked painted and original, but it didn't reliably indicate its hitbox. Our enemies, however, were the weakest part of our combat experience. We only had so many, and at the time, we were solely focused on making Liv feel as fun to control as possible. Enemies had cool and unique designs, but they didn't exactly communicate with one another. Many of their attacks were unfair, either happening from off-screen or not communicating their range to the player properly. If you were up against multiple enemies with killer attacks occurring all at once, good luck to you. At least, that's what our internal playtests were revealing. And that just wasn't fun, and by this point we were sick of an unfun game in our hands. To address this, we assigned one of our 2 programmers to focus solely on refining combat, which is much easier said than done. It was a huge commitment for both of our programmers, asking one to shoulder the burden of combat and asking the other to focus on literally everything else. But despite our lackluster combat, the other aspects of our game were strong enough to warrant multiple publisher offers. We'd really come so far. Signing with a publisher is a long and time-consuming process, but we've been grateful to them to focus on marketing so that we can focus on making Arto the best it can be. We still had to fill out the world and wrap up the game's combat system to make for a fun, unique, and memorable experience. So, back to the drawing board on enemies. We reworked all of them so that they try to encircle Liv and never attack more than X times in an instance. Something we can change and adapt for every fight. This system of global cooldowns helps prevent the player from being overwhelmed. To add more interactions between Liv and enemies, we also implemented the ability to parry attacks, as well as VFX tail indicators on each enemy's attack. Circle means the attack is parryable, X means it's not. Not exactly groundbreaking design, but it's worked for us so far. Parrying leaves enemies vulnerable and open to attacks. We made the decision to sacrifice our long-held policy of minimal to no UI in favor of gameplay fun factor. Enemy attack tails and parrying gave the player a much better feeling of control over combat. We also chose to make it so that enemies would no longer be permanently stun-locked when taking damage. They'd no longer act as bullet sponges. Now, each enemy was made to fit a very specific role. In the past, our creepy crawler enemy, it's a working name, could spawn little enemies, fire lasers, jump at the player, and melee them. And with 5 other ones of those guys on screen to keep track of, it was impossible to see what she was doing at any given moment. So, drawing inspiration from Hyperlight Drifter yet again, we chose simplicity. She still spawns little enemies, but now tries to keep her distance and occasionally fires the laser when the little ones she spawns have the melee attack. Next, we reworked our paint arrow projectile attack. We wanted to give the player some degree of customization and to make the paint arrow its own unique thing, not just another weapon. And so, we implemented a system of gates, each with choices, and balanced out its cost with mana. This allowed for over 80 possible spell combinations, each one usable in a different scenario. The vast number of possible combinations encouraged us to be crafty with the design of this system and to make it as dynamic as we could. We look forward to seeing players exploit this system, as we couldn't possibly test each combination in each scenario on our own. Finally, we wanted the player to have multiple reasons to engage enemies. We already made the moment-to-moment as fun as we could by adding head stop, new VFX, bassy sounds, and clear tells to enemies. Our other motivation for engaging enemies was having them drop currency. Players could use this to upgrade their weapons, and not just make them deal 5% more damage, but unlock completely new attacks and abilities. We also implemented a robust skill tree for the player, with each upgrade corresponding to new animations and interactions with enemies. They can be as simple as a double dash, or unlocking the ability to counter enemies after a successful parry. We've come a long way, both as a team and as makers of Arto. We started off with a rough idea and a wish list of features and zero understanding of how to actually execute on implementing any of them to a high standard. Our combat was driving us, the developers, away from our own game, which is so much worse than what you might expect from a studio full of newbies. Now, we have a branching narrative with unique and different characters, mirrored by a multitude of art styles and combat options for the player to experience. If there is one thing we've learned over the course of this adventure, it's to remember your goal and make each decision in alignment with it. Our own unwillingness to throw out or rework ideas held us back for such a long time. So, don't be afraid to spend more time in the low-cost prototype phase before scaling up to production. And don't be afraid to make hard decisions. Either you make them, or the world will force them upon you. We invite you to try out an entire level for free on our Steam page. And if you want to support us in a final stretch of this development marathon, head over to our Discord and hang out with us, engage with the growing community, and receive regular updates about the game. You can also wishlist us on Steam or secure some exclusive merch for yourselves over on our Kickstarter page. Your time and attention is greatly appreciated, and we at OrionGames sincerely hope that viewers walk away with some valuable insight or takeaways after listening to our story. Thank you, and we cannot wait to get Arto into your hands.